In 1971, 24 ordinary college students entered a fake prison beneath Stanford University. They had volunteered for a psychological experiment. They were randomly assigned to become prisoners, or guards. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks, but before it even began, the prisoners were arrested at their homes, handcuffed and taken away by real police. What happened next would become one of the most famous stories in psychology. But there was a problem. The story most people know about the Stanford Prison Experiment isn't quite what actually happened. For decades, textbooks, documentaries, and psychology classes repeated the same conclusion. Give ordinary people power over others, and they can quickly become cruel. The experiment seemed to prove something disturbing about human nature. But years later, researchers began looking more closely at what happened inside that basement. They found recordings, interviews, documents that told a very different story. The guards may not have simply become cruel on their own. Some of them were encouraged, and some of the prisoners may not have reacted as naturally as millions of people were led to believe. So how did one controversial experiment become one of psychology's most famous facts? To understand that, we have to go back to the man who created it, Philip Zimbardo. Philip Zimbardo wasn't trying to prove that ordinary people were evil. He was trying to prove something far more unsettling, that under the right circumstances, the situation around you could become more powerful than the person you thought you were. Zimbardo was a social psychologist at Stanford University, and by 1971, he had become increasingly interested in a simple question. What happens when ordinary people are placed inside a system built around power, authority, and submission? To find out, his team placed an advertisement in a local newspaper. They were looking for male college students willing to participate in a psychological study of prison life. The pay was $15 a day. More than 70 people volunteered. The researchers interviewed them, examined their backgrounds, and administered psychological tests. Eventually, 24 young men were selected. They were considered healthy, psychologically stable, and remarkably ordinary. Then came one of the most important parts of the experiment. A coin toss determined who would become a prisoner and who would become a guard. No one was selected because they seemed particularly aggressive. No one was selected because they seemed unusually submissive. At least in theory, the two groups began as equals. The researchers then transformed the basement of Stanford's psychology building into a simulated prison. Offices became cells. A small closet became solitary confinement. Cameras and microphones allowed the researchers to observe what happened inside. The guards received uniforms, whistles, batons, and mirrored sunglasses. The prisoners would lose something much more important: their names. Inside the prison, each prisoner would be identified by a number. Zimbardo himself took on the role of prison superintendent, and that decision would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire experiment. Because Zimbardo was no longer simply standing outside the system, observing what happened. He had become part of it. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks, but before the first prisoner ever entered the basement, something important had already changed. This wasn't simply a laboratory anymore. They had built a prison. They had created guards. They had created prisoners, and they had created a hierarchy. The question was what ordinary people would do once that hierarchy became real. On August 14th of 1971, the experiment began. The prisoners had no idea when the experiment would begin. Then, without warning, police cars arrived at their homes. The men were arrested in public. They were searched, handcuffed, read their rights, and taken to a real police station. They were fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in holding cells. For the participants, the line between an experiment and a real arrest was already beginning to blur. Eventually, they were transported to Stanford, but when they entered the simulated prison, another transformation began. Their clothes were removed. They were given loose prison smocks. A chain was placed around one ankle, and instead of using their names, the guards were instructed to address them by identification numbers. The message was simple. Inside this place, their normal identities no longer mattered. At first, however, things were surprisingly calm. The prisoners joked with one another. Some of the guards seemed uncomfortable with their new authority. And the first night passed without the dramatic cruelty that would later make the experiment famous. Then came the morning of the second day. The prisoners rebelled. They removed their identification numbers. They barricaded themselves inside their cells. And they refused to follow the guards' orders. For the guards, this changed everything. They called in reinforcements. They used fire extinguishers to force the prisoners away from the cell doors. They stripped some prisoners naked. They removed beds. And they began using privileges as a way to control behavior. One cell was designated the privilege cell. Prisoners considered cooperative received better food, clothing, and access to beds. Others received less. The guards also began waking prisoners during the night for repeated head counts. What had started as a way to memorize identification numbers became something else. A demonstration of control, and as the hours passed, some guards became increasingly aggressive. This is the moment that made the Stanford Prison Experiment famous. Ordinary students appeared to be transforming into abusive guards, while other ordinary students appeared to be breaking down as prisoners. For decades, this was presented as evidence of the extraordinary power of the situation. Put good people inside a bad system, and the system can change them. But there was a problem with that story, because the guards may not have invented this system of control entirely on their own. And to understand why, we need to listen to what they were told before the experiment even began.